Good afternoon and welcome back, everyone. I hope you're not tired of listening to my voice. My name is Anjali Shukla, and I'm a senior manager on the Policy and Insights team at Economist Impact, for those who've just entered the room. So we're delighted to have you join this panel discussion on climate risk, protecting ecosystems, and biodiversity. And for this panel, I'm excited to welcome my fellow panelists. We have Dave Sivaprasad, Managing Director and Partner, as well as Southeast Asia Lead of Climate and Sustainability at Boston Consulting Group. We have Koo Kok Peng, Chief Sustainability Officer at Kuala Lumpur Kepong Berhad. And we also have Winston Chow, Professor of Urban Climate and Pillar Lead Urban Infrastructure at Singapore Management University. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining me today. Great, so just to provide some context around the discussion over the next 50-odd minutes, experts believe that there is almost a 50% probability that by 2026, the world will experience average temperatures of 1.5 degrees Celsius above what's been seen before the Industrial Revolution. And that is stark. And what that means is disruptive climatic events are just going to increase in frequency, and particularly in Asia. Asia is very much at the forefront of the climate crisis, and particularly the continent's urban centers are exposed to a wide variety of risks, from drought, floods, typhoons, and rising sea levels. Now, when it comes to businesses and the legal and compliance risks that they face, they often relate to the environmental impacts of land use, environmental impacts of their business operations on land use, and particularly deforestation, because stakeholders are now increasingly approaching the courts where their livelihoods and their activity is threatened by those business operations. But at the core of all of this, there is a strong business case underlying the protection of natural capital for businesses, given their high dependence on those basic building blocks of life, like water and pollination. So before I delve into the questions that I'm really excited to ask our panelists, I just want to also get our audience involved in a quick poll survey. And for that, you can access the QR. You can access the question using the QR code that will come up on your screen. Hopefully, it is up here. And the question is, how worried is your organization about the impact of climate change on your operations? Are you very worried? Are you moderately worried? Not really worried.
Can the panelists also take part in this?
Yes, of course, by all means. Just give it a couple of seconds before the results come up.
Wow.
All right, so most of our audience thinks that most of our audience have organizations that are very worried about the impact of climate change on their operations. On that very somber note, I shall turn to our panelists now to ask, and maybe starting with Dave. Dave, in your experience working in sustainability in Asia, in what ways are ecosystems and biodiversity losses expected to impact business operations? And I think that ties well with some of the results that we're seeing. Can you help us unpack some of those top risks for businesses?
Thanks, Anjali, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this very important discussion. It's amazing to see, unambiguous agreement that this is a big issue that we all need to manage. Maybe I'll start from a private sector lens, right? From businesses and how, from our engagement, we're seeing businesses think about this issue. So the idea of impact and dependence on nature has been, largely well understood and well codified with the TNFD guidance recently. In fact, the idea of ecosystem services as having value has been well researched for more than 30 years. So this is well understood, but businesses have not, really, and I say this in a general way, it has to be de-averaged. Certain sectors are much more exposed, but in general, it's not been mainstreamed until very recently. And where we're seeing these extreme weather events, whether that is low water levels that lead to supply chain disruptions, or extreme heat or flash floods or landslides that impact your supply chains and your operations. We're increasingly starting to see the private sector across different industries say that this is something that we need to actively manage. Then we think about nature and where does this risk manifest itself. Very often we see it in a number of spaces. Water is a big one, right? Either it's too little, too much water, and it's a great intersection of climate impact and nature. Because I'll give you an example. We've worked with beverage manufacturers in the region on their operations, right? So whether that's soft drinks or beer, they're highly dependent on water. And in some countries where there's high water stress, their business is at deep risk of not being viable. So, and this is not a 20-year story, right? This is like a 2, 3, 4-year story that they're worried about. And the responses to build resilience on water is just one example. It is not just engineering, right? It is actually, how do you preserve and restore ecosystems that provide for a healthy water cycle. It is interventions that allow for you to, shore up your security of supply. And what it then implies for some of these businesses is starting to go upstream, working with their suppliers, in some instances working with government, co-investing with both capital but also technical capacity to build resilience in areas such as water. So we're starting to see the momentum, right? So I think that 88% is well justified, and we're starting to see some action in that realm as well.
Thank you, Dave. You really underscored that mutual interdependence between businesses and those building blocks of nature. Ko, maybe coming over to you, how can companies safeguard their operations against this rising climate turbulence? I mean, Dave just highlighted some of those risks. What is the progress that you are seeing? What are some of those tangible actions that companies are taking?
Yep. Perhaps a little bit of a primer in terms of what Kuala Lumpur Kepong is. We are a plantation-based integrated group with about 300,000 of planted hectarage across Malaysia, Indonesia, and Liberia. We are integrated, so we have upstream plantation, midstream refineries, and downstream oleochemicals. In the chemical side of the business, we have about 3 million tons of in-stock capacity across 14 facilities around the world. So we use land, so it is no further explanation is required that we fully understand the impact of what we do on the environment. I think what we basically internalize is that ecosystem and biodiversity are not separated from businesses. Our view of sustainability that it is about interdependence, interconnection, and inseparability. You can't distinguish one from the other. I think there was a speaker from Manulife this morning that talked about how businesses and people cannot treat the earth as an externality. Yes. So all businesses would draw on the earth's resource, in our case, land, water, and in other businesses, minerals and energy and all that. So ecosystem degradation will therefore create physical risks, and then the other consequential risks will come along. The operational risk, for example, in our case, we could potentially be facing fire or flood, which has happened. Both of them have happened. Then there will be market risks in terms of issues like price volatility, and then of course there will be financial risks in terms of return. So we are of the view that businesses can only thrive when humanity and the planet thrive, and that is the best incentive that you can have. Because I think for the longest time, for about 11,500 years, the planet has been in a very stable condition. I think it's a epoch that we call Holocene, which is from the Greek word of holo, which is whole, and scene, which is new, so it's the new whole. But I will argue that actually it is about the state of oneness, because we are also inseparable and interconnected. But we are now entering into a new epoch called Anthropocene, which is the recent age of humankind whereby human activities are beginning to have environmental impact on the earth. And so we are seeing how the earth is getting into an imbalance, and without remediation, I think the existence of humankind will come into question. And that cannot be good for business, and that cannot be good for humankind. So for us, there is no stronger incentive than that. So how does the palm business then, juxtapose into all of this? Palm has and can continue to strike a balance in this space because the world is growing in terms of the population, and food security is an issue, and we are well placed to be able to help feed this growing population for a few reasons. Palm has inherent attributes to play that role because, number one, we are high yield. We are easily 5 to 10 times better yielding than any of the other edible oil crop. What that means is that if you're going to substitute palm with other edible oils, you're going to need 5 to 10 times more land. And you're beginning to see this happening in places like Latin America. Number two, land efficiency. Palm uses 0.5% of global agriculture land, and it produces more than 35% of the global supply of edible oils. So when you compare that to pasture land, which accounts for 70% of the global agriculture land, you can see the difference in terms of the footprint. Thirdly, access. Simply because palm is so high yielding, it means that it is very affordable. And in growing, with the growing population, especially in the developing countries or developing regions like South Asia and Africa, affordable edible oils and fats are going to be very essential. And lastly, I think deforestation has fairly or unfairly been linked with palm. And I think we just have to acknowledge that in the initial growth phase of palm, deforestation did happen. But since then, the story has changed a lot. Since 1990, Brazilian soil has increased by 34 million hectares. So I'm giving the comparison, whereas Indonesian palm has grown by 15.4 million, and Malaysian palm has grown by 4 million hectares. Right? So that's the growth over a long period of time, about 30 years. But the recent trend has been very different. Deforestation in Indonesia and Malaysia has decreased by 64 and 57% respectively between the times of 2015 and 17 compared to 2020 and 2022. Yep. You contrast that with Brazil, which accounts for 43% of the global deforestation just in 2022 alone. So that's the case for palm, right? I think it's gotten somewhat unfair stigma, but I think as an industry player, I have a duty to fly the flag for the industry.
Well, thank you for that sectoral perspective, and it's promising to see that, to hear about that progress. Winston, if I can come over to you now, and I do also want to go around the panel to ask this question. What incentives can encourage business leaders to get into biodiversity conservation and ecosystem protection?
Thanks for asking that question. The short answer, I don't have to give the answer, because if you've attended this conference for the past 2 days, especially today, the answer is apparent. There is a strong business case made for biodiversity conservation because it relates to, as what Kok has said, you've articulated the business case of that so well. There is, if you can align the business case with the very strong scientific case, which has already been made. So apart from my hat at SMU as a professor of urban climate, I also wear my hat as a co-chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 2. We've assessed that utilizing nature-based solutions through biodiversity conservation has multiple synergies, not just in terms of climate mitigation, but also that of climate adaptation. You get way more co-benefits, way more bang for your buck if you place a premium, a focus on biodiversity conservation in your business practices. It can protect you from the multitude of climate risks that Dave has talked about, which are emerging, very clearly emerging in Asia, that we have to face over the next 6, 16, 20 years until the 2050 context. But more critically, if we are to get a handle on the net zero goals that we have to face to keep global temperatures to 1.5, we need to reduce our emissions by about 45 to 50% of 2019 levels. The scientific assessment that we did in our sixth assessment report, which you're more than welcome to download and read if you want to scare yourselves or you want to maybe also encourage yourselves for climate action. One of the best ways to do so is by sequestration, by nature-based solutions. Afforestation, properly managed plantations such as palm can play a role in that. Soil conservation and management on the terrestrial side, but also blue carbon, if you look into the role that marine forests can also play in terms of sequestration. They can sequester anywhere from 1 to 4 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. The science is very clear on that, but the business case needs to catch up. So there needs to be a market, a proper price for carbon, and the scientific evidence strongly suggests that higher rates of carbon sequestration can happen if the price of carbon proceeds to go up to about $100 per ton. You might think that's a lot, but you compare biodiversity conservation with more mechanical means of sequestration. Direct air capture, carbon capture storage, those are in the magnitude of about $200 to $300 per ton. So it's definitely cheaper, and the science behind biodiversity conservation is much more mature than that of these mechanical ways of sequestration. That said, while you have the ingredients for successful climate action with biodiversity conservation, business case, scientific case, the government policy case still remains to be settled. So Dave and I, we were in Dubai for COP28, and I believe several in the audience members were also there. The key thing to watch out for is what happens in the discussions for Article 6, particularly 6.2 and 6.4, whether or not these frameworks that allow for bilateral trading of carbon, which can support these markets, getting past the issues of methodology, getting past the issues of confidentiality. If these can be settled, hopefully by this year in Baku, then we can take that next step towards enabling good climate action to keep the world to 1.5 degrees C.
Just on the point of sequestration, I thought it's a good segue, right? There are also other incentives that are emerging in our business. So customers in the FMCG sector are looking for low product carbon footprint. They're looking at low LCA factors and things like that. And where palm is distinct from the other edible oil is that it's a perennial crop. So it sequesters carbon over a 25-year cycle, very different from the other edible oil crop, which is an annual crop, right? So there is no sequestration. So I think that, coupled with the fact that it is high yield and is able to provide for low PCF and good LCA numbers, also creates an inherent incentives for the palm business to do well to protect that sequestration.
Thank you, Winston, and cool. Dave, you as well. How can businesses be incentivized to protect ecosystems and biodiversity in your perspective?
It's a great question, Anjali, and I don't think there's a simple answer, but I think there's a good first step, right? The first step is really creating visibility on where you're going to face these impacts.
Yep.
Because once you have visibility, and that's of course a combination of data, it's taking climate science, it's downscaling it down to your operations, your supply chains, and really understanding the impacts, and similarly also evaluating with evidence what is your dependence on nature, whether that's on the water cycle or whether that's on genetic material because you're in a pharma industry, putting some numbers that then can connect to your commercial interests, I think is a very important first step. So once you have that basis, then we can talk about the incentives. Now, there are very practical problems around this, right? And biodiversity, part of the challenge is how do you measure? And certainly there's good guidance, as we said earlier, with TNFD and so on, but it's a complex challenge. It's localized, you have to talk about the species, you talk about, the water quality. There are many aspects of this that one needs to consider. And for businesses to get that first step, just getting the right level of technical capacity to be able to address this is also a challenge. But this is where industry coalitions, government, right, academic bodies can play a key role in helping to provide that technical capacity, that access to expertise and understanding to be able to evaluate what does it mean. And then you can connect it to cash flow and balance sheet, right? Then you start getting into the incentive question.
Thank you, Dave. I think that makes it very clear for me. And maybe as a follow-up question to that, do you see that progress in Asia? Are businesses making those initial assessments to, on what their dependence is on natural capital and then moving from there? Is there like on-the-ground experience of that happening?
I think we're seeing a lot of movement in that direction. I think it's highly de-averaged by country and by sector. I think we see, at least from our vantage point, from our work in BCG, we're seeing it a lot in industries that have land use and water dependence, right? That's where a lot of this focus is coming up. But interestingly, we're also seeing it in areas such as access to a healthy labor force. Interestingly, and let me expand on that a bit. So some of the companies that we work with, they're manufacturing environments. They work, their operations are in areas where there's expected high heat stress, and some of them have exposure to flash floods. They're worried about not just the impacts that this would bring to their physical assets, but their workforce, right? If their workforce are struck with significant increase in heat-related health issues, this impacts their business, right? So these are things that we're starting to get engagement on. It's certainly not at the stage where a company is saying, okay, let's go and invest in upstream healthcare for our workforce yet, but it's a recognition that this is a problem that we'll need to work with, and that in itself is a positive first step, back to the first point on creating visibility on the issue.
That's really promising to hear, and very much agree with the heat stress bit that you said, because I read a very darning statistic somewhere that India particularly is going to be at the forefront of heat stress, with the country projected to lose almost 6% of its working hours by 2030, and for a large population like that, that's a staggering number.
Can I quickly intervene on this point, if you don't mind? But a good point on the heat stress, which I can also talk about. But Dave mentioned the importance of labor forces. For reducing the vulnerability of that, that's critical. But in terms of making sure that these can be protected through investments, the right investments, capital investments in your labor force, in order for it to be sustainable, because it's a long-term problem, you need to invest in the knowledge capital as well of people who are, over the next, for the rest of the decade, for the rest of this decade and until 2050, being informed about these risks that we face and how to, the corollary based on that, how to manage them and how to reduce the risk, requires a substantial investment in reskilling and retraining and education of these very vulnerable populations, regardless of any sector, and particularly in Asia. So, for instance, the work that I'm doing in my university, we have a new Masters of Sustainability program that starts in August, trying to inform mid-career or fresh graduates on these sort of dilemmas that we're facing in trying to reduce climate risk. Proper education on what good climate action is, understanding how capital flows can be redirected to reduce vulnerabilities. For instance, in the example you just mentioned, Anjali, on heat stress in India, how good examples of heat risk reduction can be implemented in places like Ahmedabad, for instance. You don't really require strong amounts of financial capital in air conditioning the whole place. You need early warning systems. You need targeted resource management in diverting resources to the most vulnerable people exposed to heat stress, primarily in informal settlements. These plans can succeed, but it's just a question of educating the right people who will be dealing with the risks that they are facing until 2050 and beyond, to make sure these vulnerabilities are addressed.
Absolutely, absolutely, Winston. Thank you for making that point. Ko, coming back to you, businesses at this point of time have a number of competing priorities, right? In the economic uncertainty that we're living in, there's always the looming risk of a recession. There's always high capital costs. So among all of these competing business priorities, how can that long-term focus and investment on ecosystem protection and biodiversity conservation be encouraged among businesses? And what sort of progress are you seeing in the Asian region, if you can share some thoughts on that?
Like I mentioned earlier, it makes sustainability makes good business sense, especially when you're using nature capital. And well, of course, the protection of biodiversity, if you have specific project on that, is very helpful. But I think in terms of how the businesses that operate using nature capital is also very important. So case in point is, for example, if you look at circularity and how circularity works in a palm operation, you would very quickly realize when you visit an estate that actually there is no waste there is coming out of the upstream. Everything is in a circular. Let me describe that to you. So we have palms, and they were what you call fruit for 25 years. When you replant them, the trunks and the fronds are actually chipped and pulverized, and they're left in the field because those nutrients goes back to the field. So whatever that is sequestered actually goes back to earth. When we harvest the fresh fruit bunches and we crush it for the oil, the empty fruit bunches are also returned to the land, and they are actually very rich in potassium, so you actually don't have to buy what you call fossil-based chemicals to put back. The palm kernel shell that comes in the palm fruit is actually used to power out our boiler to create steam and also to create electricity. So the mills is actually self-sufficient. And then we have the palm oil meal effluent, which goes, water discharge that goes into the pond, and where more and more the mills are putting methane capture facility and turning them into power, and potentially down the road we could turn that to bio-CNG that can be used for industries as well. So that circularity is actually very important, and it makes a lot of business sense. So when you look at intervention, you look at intervention that is pragmatic. You look at intervention that makes sense from an environmental perspective and from a financial perspective. I very much like a quote that was said by the Singapore Transport Minister some months back, where he said we should take a pragmatic approach based on science and evidence instead of an ideological approach based on preconceived bias and dogma.
Yeah.
So I think just look at the issue and be very practical, be mindful of the impact that you have on nature, and be very clear in terms of how you could very pragmatically protect that biodiversity in your own operation. And then over and beyond that, of course, you can do more in terms of external landscape biodiversity contribution or nature conservation as well.
Thank you. Thank you for talking about circularity, very important across sectors, actually, not just palm. I now want to steer the discussion a little bit in the direction of some of the newer instruments that are emerging where nature is being made a capital asset. So we're talking about carbon credits, we're talking about biodiversity credits more specifically, and then also pricing in nature-related risks. Winston, perhaps coming over to you and focusing on pricing those nature-related risks, do you see the potential in that as an instrument in helping undo some of the damage to our biodiversity and ecosystem?
A tricky question to answer, Charlie, because what I say, sometimes people will want to use that against me, but I will be as diplomatic as possible. Eventually, there will be a good price to account for natural capital. There will be a good price to account for biodiversity credits or these sort of very important carbon credit schemes. It all goes back to what goes on at the multilateral level. Is there a proper framework to actually make sure that there is accountability, make sure that there's a proper methodology to ensure that the amount of carbon sequestered actually is legitimate, whether there's buy-in, whether or not there's openness versus confidentiality of those particular frameworks. It has to be resolved, and it will be resolved at some point. I'm a glass half full person in terms of that being taken care of at the next climate conference of parties, because as has been said by the rest of the panel, the case is there to be made. It's a very viable option. It makes a perfect business sense, aligns with that science-based issues that my transport minister has said in Singapore. If we follow the logical conclusion, there is money to be made, and it's for very renewable starved countries like Singapore, for instance. These sort of carbon credits need to be in there for our eventual mitigation purposes, because we are physically unable to try and sequester carbon with our small land area, amongst other things. So it will happen. The question is when. And I would think that given the urgency of the climate and biodiversity crisis that we're having so far, it will have to happen sooner rather than later.
Right. Would you also say that there's comparatively lesser awareness about biodiversity credits as compared to more generally carbon credits? Is that also a challenge that you see emerging?
Yes, it's very clear. The attention towards carbon credits is this high, biodiversity credits is catching up, I would say. That said, given that in the last climate assessment that we did with the IPCC, we pointed out that one way to deal with a sort of a policy-relevant approach that governments can learn from and businesses can follow up on is through this concept called climate-resilient development, where you look into approaches that have synergies between adaptation and mitigation. You reduce risks, you help with reducing carbon emitted into the atmosphere, take it away from there. You bring in the sustainable development goals, which also occurred at the same time as the Paris Agreement, and not many people pay attention to that. But the fourth critical component is biodiversity conservation. There is no need for, from the scientific perspective, to make a case for nature. It's already clear and apparent how we persuade governments, how we persuade businesses. Actually, to be fair, persuading governments is trickier than businesses. I don't have to push that through, given the, and it's very clear from the events in today's conference that there's no need to make a very strong case. It's already emergent there. If this persists on, and the sentiment is that governments, with the next set of assessment reports that we're developing, they are bringing that on board their decision making. And again, it leads to that sort of optimism I have in terms of having not just carbon credits, but also biodiversity credits included in the discussion for climate action.
Certainly. Dave, I'd also like to get your thoughts on the same question, actually. Do you see potential in pricing in nature-related risks and biodiversity credits?
Yeah, I think Vincent answered it very well. So look, I think, we have the practical challenges of measurement, right, that we'll need to overcome. Perhaps, and I'm going to maybe step out a little bit, out of the zone of the question, it's a greater appreciation of the science that's well known but needs to be mainstreamed, right? So what I mean by that is that, this concept of the value of nature, the ecosystem services, whatever you would like to call it, there's huge value to society and, by extension to economies and by extension to businesses and, commercial interests, right? So that line of sight is clear. Perhaps it's elevating that into saying, so let's get practical examples and showcase this much more. So the health benefits of locations where nature is preserved, there's evidence behind this. There's evidence behind how your water cycles are more resilient. There's evidence behind how your food systems are more resilient, with a focus on nature, biodiversity, and hence, resilience. And being able to then tell that narrative with case studies, with stories, and because these are localized issues, you can't generalize, you need to, have these stories across. I think that's a positive step forward before we even get to, pricing it. Right? I think if there's general understanding, then it'll be a smaller step forward to economic pricing, let's say.
So I see that you also see the glass half full rather than empty, because you think that even that growing awareness is a good first step before we actually get to pricing.
I share Winston's sentiment of half full.
I think my final question, I'd just like to maybe shed some light on the role of the public sector. I know we've talked quite extensively about businesses, but anybody really from the panel who would like to take that question on, how important do you think is the role of the public sector and governments, especially in furthering that cause of biodiversity conservation? I mean, in recent times, we've seen many examples of, for example, Norway committing almost $47 billion, I believe, yes, $47 billion in biodiversity adaptation and conservation. The US as well pledging quite a high number for enteric methane reduction. Do you see the momentum rising from the government's side as well? Who
Yep.
would?
So if I bring the story back to the palm industry, right, where the public sector can come in really is to focus on the productivity and improving on the yield. So what's happening, as you can see from the palm prices just in the last couple of months, is that prices have gone up because supply is very tight. And the reason why supply is tight is A, deforestation has gone down. There's hardly any more new greenfield planting. But more, I think, concerning is that the yield in both Malaysia and Indonesia has gone down because the age profiles of the palm has grown older, right? So there is a need for the public sector to be really focused in ensuring that the age profile is youngified and then they can produce higher yield. And what is important is then therefore the urgency or the incentive to then deforest because you need to produce more is no longer there. But having said that, I think sometimes public policy can lead to some unintended consequence. I think case in point being the SAF mandate. I think what has happened with the SAF mandate is it has driven more deforestation with the cultivation of less efficient crops, oil crops. And you can see this in Latin America. And the other phenomenon that has happened is the proliferation of used cooking oil and palm oil meal effluent export. So you see a huge amount of UCO export coming out of China and POMI coming out of Indonesia. It just doesn't make sense because I think the likelihood is that it has been laced with some oil in it as well. So these are not waste per se. So this is where the mandate has got to be very careful because otherwise it will produce a lot of unintended consequence. So if the guidance is provided to say that palm has a role to play, and the Singapore Transport Minister basically said that palm has a role to play in SAF, and if it's not the rest of the world, perhaps it starts with ASEAN and Asia Pacific, then you first look at the waste, the upstream POME, real POME, midstream, the palm fatty acid distillates, which will otherwise be used for low-value items like soaps, and also downstream oleochemical waste as well, pitches and things like that, which can be used in part to support the SAF. Then the rest of it can come from tallow and used cooking oil, right? But that guidance has got to be done just right. Otherwise, the consequence could be somewhat unintended.
Right. Sorry.
Could
Yes.
I follow up on Kok Peng's excellent points? I love the unintended consequences which happens when public policy is not inclusive. It doesn't. You have to include as many stakeholders into the discussion. So it's a segue to your question about what role does the public sector have to play. It's an immense role. I view it as a three-legged stool between people, private and public sector. If you want good climate action, you need all three to basically stand up the entire stool. You remove away one, the stool falls over. And far too often, for many places around the world, in ASEAN as well, the public sector is not talking, not coordinating, not getting all these important stakeholders into the policy discussion. That said, I don't want to talk too much about Singapore, but I have to in this case. They do realize that if you want good anything related to sustainability, you need to have that discussion, you need to have that inclusivity element in there. So they've engaged with the academic sector a lot. For instance, in SMU, the Singapore Green Finance Center works very closely with the Monetary Authority of Singapore to make sure that the sort of financial risks from climate change can be accounted for and solutions can be developed into that. I don't talk too much about that. More information, come and find us at our booth outside. We would love to engage with people here. That also said, as long as there is that constant communication, that urge to lead, because as it is very clear now, the private sector, academic sector, science sector, they are way ahead of most public sectors in terms of incorporating policy development. They have to catch up, and hopefully the hope is that it will happen.
So that guidance role that the public sector plays is clearly an important starting point for everything else to fall in place. We are almost at time, but we have a few minutes for audience Q&A. So if there's anyone who wishes to ask a question to any of our panelists, please feel free to raise your hand and somebody will attend to you with a mic. Yes, please. Please introduce yourself and where you work at as well.
Hi, my name is Rohini from CDD India. It's an NGO in India. My question, I think most of three of you can actually answer it, any one of you. When it comes to protecting ecosystem or biodiversity, it is not like a short-term programs. Typically, it's a long-term. How do you, as a company, how do you, see, because this is not just 1 year investment, it's a lot of time takes, like even 5 years, 6 years, to bring back to that kind of a biodiversity. So what is your view on it? Because we mostly tend to do it like any infrastructure project. Okay, I'll give a money, finish it in a year. But this is not like that. The ecosystem biodiversity is a long-term process. What is your view on that? How do you see as a company is moving on long-term process?
I think you have to take the long-term view, that's for sure. So I also sit on the board of the Roundtable of Sustainable Palm Oil. And there is a RECP process. So for example, if there has been a development where deforestation has taken place after 2014, then you need to compensate for that. And that compensation needs to last for a period of 25 years. Because then what happens is that it has the longevity to make sure that the restoration that you've done to compensate for the damage that you have incurred is actually going to stay as permanent as possible. And if you've gone past 25 years, the likelihood that it will stay on is going to be there. So businesses and the industry have to take the long-term view on this.
Thank you. Any other question from the audience? Yes, please. This side.
Thank you. Siriphon from 30 by 30 Thailand Coalition. So I would like to ask all the speaker, like, what is the awareness of the private sector in your area about their understanding about the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework with all the 20T target? And I think there's a necessity for every sector help communicate those. I think most people already aware about the SDG, right? But we so much far behind about, on the understanding. And I would like to ask also, you have experience, because for private sector, sometimes when we talk about protecting ecosystem, people think about planting trees. And sometimes it's not a solution. But the thing is, like, they need it for the CSR activity, company image. But this activity is not recommended. So, and sometimes they don't listen to the scientific. So what would be the best solutions for everybody to, encourage the private sector to put the money into the right place? For example, long-term data monitoring or, proper species. Thank you.
Maybe I can take the question on what we've seen from our vantage point as BCG engaging different private sector players. I think there are a few, let's say, catalytic events that have shifted the focus towards nature in the private sector. The first being, COP15 with the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is, has got 196 countries signing up, right? So the private sector stood up and paid attention. So this is something that we need to, worry about and think about, and what does it mean for our business. And last year we had TNFD guidance, and SBTN is working on measurements. So I think these catalytic events have shifted the, at least a large part of the leaders in respective sectors to say, we really need to start moving, from a climate agenda to a nature positive agenda. The number of times I've had conversations on nature positive has just exponentially increased over the last 6 months, I would say. So that's a positive momentum. But that said, very often it is businesses, except for the ones that are directly impacted, right? It is them figuring out and understanding what does it mean. They don't yet fully appreciate the implications, which then comes to the second question, second part of the question, on what you would do. And our recommendation when we're engaging these companies is really start to build the bridges and collaborate, right? Like with the academic institutions, like the technical experts that are out there. And there's, loads of technical expertise. You just have to, build the bridges and start collaborating on this, because it is a complex problem, and no one institution can address it themselves. And the more there is bridges of collaboration, both with different parties in the ecosystem, but also across your value chains and supply chains, the more clear it becomes what is it that you can do And I go back to the water example because the water example is very pragmatic. You have, let's say, back to the beverage manufacturer working with upstream farmers, including smallholders, on how you would increase water efficiency and irrigation practices. This gets into very practical programs that translate some of them into projects that require some investment, but some of it, is low capex. It's capacity building in the upstream. So there are a lot of different things that you can do, but you do need to make the connections.
I hope that answers your question. Well, thank you very much to all our panelists.